Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm your host, Brian Scott. Today we have a very interesting channeling from Quo. I was somewhat interested when you read the Ra material, the Law of One material, and they ask Ra about Jesus. He explains there was somebody named Yahashua, and this was a real being. So I did a search to see with Quo if there was discussion of Yehoshua, and to see if there was further information about the life of Jesus that they could give in their channeled information. Now, in many cases, Quo is limited by the law of confusion and they can't be very specific, but it's interesting in terms of the Quo channeling that Carla, who's one of the primary channelers of the Quo principle, was deeply Christian and profoundly Christian, challenging every entity that she channeled in the name of the Christ. So I was interested if they had asked Quo more about Jesus and his life, and I have a few channelings that give us some further information. We begin with a channeling given on December 14th, 1986. The question has to do with the season, more specifically the birth of Christ, the life of Christ, and whether there may be any discrepancies in the time, place, and what he had to teach in a couple of side queries along the line of virgin birth, how it was accomplished, and the meaning of the Christmas to Jesus. Carla channeling says, I am Quo, and I greet you in the love and in the light of the one infinite Creator, in whose name and whose service we answer your call. We greet each of you this evening, and thank you for the privilege of being allowed to share our thoughts with you. We urge you, as always, to remember that we offer our personal opinions and our beliefs, not infallibility. Therefore, listen to us in goodwill, but lay down those thoughts that do not seem helpful. We find that in speaking about the subject of Jesus the Christ, we must be more careful than usual to guard against infringement upon free will, for this entity is centrally important to some of those present, and we wish our words not to be stumbling blocks, nor to be paths into an unproductive wilderness, but rather help disclosures for neutral information. There are some levels of understanding above that which you in third density enjoy, which are necessary for the grasp of the full nature of Jesus the Christ. For you who seek this entity shall be in part a mystery to the conscious mind, not because there was an intention to be mysterious, but because the nature of Christ is mystery. We take this somewhat slowly, as we are working with this instrument for a more delicate balance with less control from us and more surrender from the instrument, which enables a lesser amount of energy to be adequate for transmission of adequate thoughts. This will eventually, we hope, enable the instrument to work at a deeper level while still conscious. We thank you for your patience. To continue, the entity known as Yaheshua, whom Greeks called Jesus, or rather Yesu, was born closely upon the heels of midsummer, very few years before that year suggested by your histories, approximately 5½ years. We believe this is the correct measurement. We only may say it was in the middle of the 7th month. We are sorry, but your numbering does not make enough sense to us. We understand your moons, but not your numbers. We cannot speak about what this instrument calls the virgin birth, and invoke the law of confusion, saying only that each new soul first awakened to its perception of itself as an eternal being has experienced the virgin birth. The event was difficult, and the birth was indeed humble, though brightened by an optical illusion, shall we say, a most unusual configuration within the heavens, which caused there to appear to be, for some of your months, an unusually bright cluster of light in the night sky. The combination of the Christ with a serviceable life channel was powerful, and many psychic events occurred before and after the event, as well as at that time of it. Astrologer kings did indeed journey following the star. However, the arrival was approximately 1.5 years later. That indeed is a spiritual adventure you would do well to ponder as you approach your own stable, looking for the newborn, guided by hope, the brightest star of your being. The entity Jesus was loved, and loved in return, but his mind drove him to be alone. For though too young to have established to his own satisfaction the nature of his being, he had tremendous hunger for wisdom. You would call this entity a child prodigy. The entity taught many, many more things than are written, and could continue teaching for in eternity. Yet what has been recorded is typical enough of the teaching's content in general that we do not choose to take this opportunity to adjust the teachings that are recorded. It is not only that there is some infringement upon free will, although that is part of our caution, we also do not wish to sway those who have not become interested in the Christ to alter their viewpoints. For above and apart from any writing about the Christ, there is the Christ, and that which this teacher, channel, and representative of the Creator called the Holy Spirit. Call it what you will. There are many, many avenues in which the Christ speaks to each whenever the inner ear is opened, and the ear harks, not listening passively, but leaning forward and truly harking. The concept of the Christ was this, that intelligent infinity as experienced by the Logos and the bias of the Logos would enter a third density experience, not erasing the one known as Jesus' personality or being, but coming into the closest possible harmony with that being. There needed to be one who wished to sacrifice an incarnation to the ever-increasing pleasure and agony of the Creator, experiencing what this instrument would call the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. For it is the nature of the Christ and the nature of third density that the two, perceiving each other, should react. The third density with a lack of understanding, and the Christ with wonder, joy, and sacrifice. Such is the sorrow of your illusion and the joy of sensation and communion. In the end, Jesus the man became so able to bear both joy and agony that this entity stopped experiencing the Creator and for long periods of time became the Creator experiencing third density. Such is the perfect channeling of love. The achievement of the perfect channeling was the mystery of union between Creator and illusion. After this bonding, the burden of channeling rather rapidly began to tire the Master Jesus. At the time of the crucifixion, as this instrument calls it, there were almost no tears left. There were no bones unbroken. There was no companionship that had not been betrayed in one form or another. Nevertheless, Jesus the Christ lived well and did not stop the channeling until the breath left the physical vehicle. We witness to this Christ with thanksgiving and joy, not suggesting that any worship or not worship, but celebrating the Creator poured into a channel who could share in the full nature of the Logos, the nature of love, the Creator's powerful, terrible love. You ask what Jesus the Christ would think of the way your people celebrate Christmas. My friends, Jesus is very pleased. He is pleased to see all that is given and received of love, generosity, and cheerfulness. This entity never confused the personal life that he lived with the Christ he channeled, and in the end gave way to completely, but always knew the source and called it the Father. Call it what you will. We have no dogma or doctrine, but celebrate love. It is the Creator who is pleased that those who do celebrate the spiritual advent of light into the darkness, yet the Creator will also celebrate the same event on another level in each of your lives, whatever your season of Christmastide may be, whenever your star beckons. We've come to the point in our discussion of the one known as Jesus in which we share some information concerning the perceptions which the one known as Jesus would perhaps make upon the patterns and rituals of observing this occasion that is known as the Mass of Christ's birth. Indeed, within each entity who seeks answers to the mysteries of life, there is a season during which the activities of the entity cease and the focus of attention is pointed inward. The fruitful time in the sense of experience gained is considered within the inner being to be likened as to a foundation for that which is to come. Within each entity that seeks these truths of experience, there comes the time when there will be a new beginning. This is often preceded by the trials which test that which has been known and applied to experience. From these trials, then, the entity moves to the limits of its being, and through a sacrifice of its own knowing and unknowing, and a surrender of these to that force which is paramount in the life pattern, call it the one Creator, or love, or the Christ consciousness, if you will. With this surrender, then, comes the possibility of a new seeding of awareness and experience within the seeker. As each of your peoples then take part in the celebrations in the name of the Christ of Jesus, each then does also partake in some fashion of the ritual of renewal and eventual resurrection of the Christed consciousness within each manifested vehicle, which has the Logos as source and motivator in the great experience of evolution which each of you undertakes. There are, of course, many distractions to any life pattern and celebration, such as the one which this season has provided once again. At this time, we feel that we have shared that which is congruent with our perception of your call. We would then at this time ask if we might speak upon any further topics or attempt clarity with regards to that which we have shared this evening. Did I understand correctly that the birth of Jesus occurred in midsummer, or did I hear that incorrectly? I am Quo, and we spoke thusly, my brother. May we speak in any further fashion. And the birth of Christ was approximately 5½ years prior to the time our historians believe it to be the actual birth of Christ. Is that correct? I am Quo, and as accurately as we can perceive your measurement of time, this figure is relatively accurate. Question: what was the name of the entity that gave physical birth to the baby Jesus? I am Quo, and we find that the literal translation of this entity's naming, as you call it, is not possible, but is approximated by the sound vibratory complex that is known among your peoples as Mary. May we speak further, my brother. From tonight's lesson, I think I understood that Jesus, before incarnating in third density, chose to incarnate into third density, but somehow was granted the ability not to go through the veiling process that normal third density beings go through prior to incarnation into this dimension. Is this correct? I am Quo, and we find that this has correctness to it, though we see some difficulty in a full exploration of the nature of that awareness that was experienced by the one known as Jesus. This entity was able to retain pathways of perception, shall we say, in its incarnate state that were easily activated in a sequential fashion, according to experience gained throughout the incarnation, so that at a latter point within the incarnation, this entity was able to channel and experience the love of the Father, which you would call the Logos, in a fashion which was in harmonious resonance with the personality, shall we say, of the one known as Jesus, without obliterating that personality. Why was it necessary tonight for the ones doing the channeling to do a deeper state of concentration, shall I say, in order to bring about this channeling tonight? I am Quo. The reasons were two. Firstly, the topic queried upon was one which is central to the incarnational patterns of some within this group. Thus, there was some added risk in the possible infringement upon free will. Secondly, the nature of the queries was of a specific enough focus that in order to respond with the appropriate information, there was the necessity of the ones serving as instruments to move to deeper portions of the conscious mind, so that less static, shall we say, would be likely to interfere with the concepts being transmitted. Question: will there be another incarnation of this entity on the planet Earth? I am Quo, and we find that it is not the entity known as Jesus that shall appear again, but the Christed consciousness which shall move through those of your population which have prepared a place for this consciousness. I'm a little confused. Can you explain further about a place for this event? I am Quo. We begin to speak of such a preparation in the final portion of our opening message for this evening, when we spoke of those seekers of truth who retire to the inner portions of the self to stand upon the foundation of that which has been gained of experience and reach for that which is cloaked in mystery and attempt to bring forth within the incarnational pattern the proper conditions that will allow the same channeling of love which the one known as Jesus accomplished in its life pattern. This ritual of celebration, as we called the process, is one which each entity observes in some fashion in the season during which the birth of the one known as Jesus is celebrated. The process was demonstrated by the incarnation of the one known as Jesus, eventually culminating in the resurrection of the Christed consciousness within the life pattern of the seeker residing within the third density illusion. Thus, by such seeking and the exercise of faith, does the seeker prepare a place within the life pattern for this resurrection, shall we say. Question: I have a couple, maybe just one. Immediately after Christ resurrected from the tomb, was his body solid, or would it pass through doors like a vapor? I am Quo. The entity known as Jesus at the time that known as the resurrection was able to channel the love of the Father or the Logos to such an extent that it was able to affect the structure of its physical vehicle in a way which filled it with light, so that it was able to manifest both the characteristics of your third density illusion when appropriate, and able also to refine its focus of light to the point of being able to move through what you would see as solid material of your third density illusion. Question: could you explain the configuration of which you spoke in the skies that created the optical illusion of illumination or a cluster of light at the time of the birth of Christ? I am Quo, and we pause in order to allow this instrument to move somewhat more deeply. Patterns of light that became obviously apparent to the physical eye of those within the vicinity of that known as the Holy Land were produced by an unusual alignment of both planets and constellations of stars that seemed to focus their brilliance upon a point which seemed far nearer your Earth planet by far than even your moon, so that there was projected from this alignment of celestial bodies a focus for their light that approached this planetary sphere at a focal point which was seen as a sign to those who studied the skies, and more specifically the stars. Was this configuration or alignment of the celestial bodies coincidental, or was it to fulfill the prophecy of the birth of Jesus the Christ? I am Quo, and we may note that this alignment was a cyclical event, which was an integral portion of the evolutionary cycle of your planetary sphere, which provided a doorway of a kind through the metaphysical realms, shall we say. That was the signal for the opportunity for the one known as Jesus to begin its service in the fashion which became known as its incarnational experience. If this configuration is cyclical, when will it occur again? I am Quo, and this particular configuration or opportunity for refining the focus of consciousness is that which appears near the ending of what we find many of your peoples call a major cycle of evolution, that which numbers approximately 25,000 of your years. This opportunity allows those of a planetary population who ready for the harvest or graduation, as we find you call it, to begin the full final lessons that will allow such graduation. The refining of the focus of consciousness is the general opportunity which is provided to each in a unique fashion for each. Question: would it be possible for you to tell us approximately where the exact location is then? I am Quo, and we are not able to move this instrument deeply enough in its own tree of mind for the transmission of this information, and we apologize for this limitation. Indeed, we find that the focus required for this particular transmission has begun to waver somewhat within the instrument. Carla then asks, I'd like to ask one last question, and then with thanks encourage you to go on, because it does seem like the instrument's really tired. I know this was tiring for me too, but I thank you for coming. First of all, two things. Just yes or no. Did you mean a 25,000 year cycle or a 75,000 year cycle? Because you said major cycle. I'm Quo, and we meant to use the term major to signify the 25,000 year cycle, reserving the term master for the addition of 3 25,000 year cycles. Carla says, okay, the last question is just yes or no, but I'd have to go on for just a little bit because I've been pondering what you said earlier about mysteries. And the real mystery, you didn't decline to answer that much, but there was one thing that you hinted at, but it was a real mystery. Was a contradiction, which of course is the nature of spiritual things, and that was this, that you had me thinking for a while that Jesus was, well, we've gotten in other information, a wanderer that decided he was up to doing this job and came here, and in other information we've learned, he was awakened to some lifting of the veil, and it kept happening until he was real aware. So basically, he channeled the Christ through his life, but there's always a distinction between Jesus the man and the Christ. Now, there was something that you said that hinted at the mystery, and that was you said ultimately the Christ became Jesus, which would suggest more of a walk-in situation where the Christ comes in and basically takes over the consciousness. Yet at the same time, you said the one known as Jesus never forgot that it wasn't he. It was the Creator that he was channeling. Is this the heart of the mystery that you cannot in any satisfactory way explain to third density minds? I am Quo. This is indeed the mystery, my sister, for within the third density illusion, each seeker of what you call the truth places itself in a position of receptivity to that truth by the intensity of the seeking, the strength of faith and will, so that at some point within the cycle of incarnations, it is possible for such a seeker to not only discover that which it seeks, but to become that which it seeks. Thus is the meaning of the resurrection within third density. The seeker builds with mortal hands a manifested life that may be constructed in such a fashion in metaphysical terms that known as love may move through the being in such a pure fashion as to shine as that which it is, the pure and virgin consciousness of the one Creator, moving to gain the experience of the creation which it has made of itself, and doing this within the life pattern of incarnate third density beings who have prepared this place within their life patterns, and thus not only receive that which was sought, but become that which was sought. May we speak further? Carla says, no, that's food enough for thought. Thank you very much for an elegant answer. I am Quo, and we thank you, my sister. Do you have any other questions? Yes. T says, this is the true meaning. What you just stated is basically to my way of thinking. I'm asking if this is true. The true meaning of achieving oneness, becoming one, in other words, the physical and higher self in very simplistic terms, truly become one. When this point is achieved that you just described, is that basically correct? I am Quo, and this is correct, my brother. For the inheritance of each portion of the one Creator is the one Creator. Much there is that shall be learned during the time of incarnation within the third density illusion, where the veils of forgetting are moved into place to enable the experience within the illusion to be of an intensity that provides each portion of the Creator the fullest range of opportunity to know the power of love, to redeem and resurrect even the tiniest portion of the one Creator. Thus, when each seeker moves to the point at which it may so perfectly channel the one Creator in its love aspect, then each portion of the life pattern takes on a holy appearance, and all is seen as sacred. Moving to another channeling delivered on December 6, 2003, they ask, the week in the spirit of the season that we are entering, we would like some information on the entity that we know of as Jesus the Christ, Jesus of Nazareth. We would appreciate any information about this entity or incarnation very much. Quo says, we are those known to you as the principle of Quo, and we greet you in the love and light of the one infinite Creator in whose service we come to you today. You asked this day concerning the one known as Jesus. This entity has been known by several names. The name of his youth was Yehoshua. The name of Jesus is not that which this entity heard unless it was spoken by those not of his own country, for that particular name is the Greek version of an Aramaic name. However, we shall call this entity Jesus, since it is the name under which each of you calls to him when you speak in your conversation with those entities you cannot see, but whose influence you certainly feel. The life of the one known as Jesus was indeed somewhat unusual, in that the entity was an unusual being, sharing in company with many of those within the circle, and many of those who call themselves wanderers. The facility of mind and sharpness of intellect that enabled this entity at a very young age to be one who was intellectually able to study and to grasp abstract concepts in such a way that this entity was by its very nature prone to thinking upon the mysteries that it could not solve, the greatest mystery of all being that mystery of the lack of limit to the imagination. This infinity and eternity that one known as Jesus felt within him pulled him ever forward. And being fortunate enough to dwell in what this instrument would call a small town, where his family had a humble but adequate home, in a community of those who could teach spiritual or religious subjects, the one known as Jesus was one who hung about such teachers, reading and asking questions and reading again, until at a young age, as a teenager, this entity was considered a kind of rabbi. Along with the scholarly pursuits that this entity pursued as his principal hobby, the entity also spent many hours at the side of his father and his uncle, learning their trades and working with wood and gathering various herbs and other natural substances which were known to have healing benefits. The one known as Jesus tended to be somewhat of a loner and liked nothing better than to steal away at nightfall. There was, near the village in which his parents lived, a high place in the surrounding terrain. It was nothing more than what this instrument would call a knob or a small rise of rock. Yet the climbing of this modest knob to the ridge of it created within him a feeling of peace that he did not find elsewhere. It was his habit to gaze at the stars and imagine the lack of limit. The overriding sense of infinite possibility would rest upon him at those times, and much of the actual substance of this entity's spiritual maturity was gained not because of the teaching of his parents or the teaching of those spiritual teachers which the small town offered, but rather the silence which he was able to find within himself while gazing into the depths of the night sky. At the age of approximately 14, this entity was offered the opportunity to study with two other entities from the same small town who were also those who had an interest in the spiritual studies that the village rabbis were glad to offer. And so there ensued a period of some years where this entity studied, prayed, and meditated with a group of what this instrument would call Essenes. This further enabled the one known as Jesus to discipline his somewhat mischievous and wayward personality, and to refine within himself the hunger that he felt for the truth. Gradually, as he began to mature into an adult person, it came to him that he must travel, and so he began to walk upon a path that was as varied as his sense of each day's shape. He set off upon a pilgrimage, although the one known as Jesus certainly did not think in terms of such. but rather simply that he was called to the road, and guided by Spirit in silence, he walked through parts of Africa and parts of India. We have difficulty placing names with this instrument as she was no familiar with those regions. Braving hunger and extremes of weather, the one known as Jesus walked many a weary mile and visited the campfires and caves and the holy places of those who thought along the same lines as those he was taught and those who did not, learning always accumulated wisdom and sifting it, winnowing it, and gradually coming into a fuller and fuller sense of who he was, not as the one who had learned these things, but as the one who had witnessed the process of that learning and its tumbling about and settling into those patterns of thought that he found very truly helpful. It was during that phase that the one known as Jesus gradually became more and more aware of the shape of his future ministry. We give this instrument the image of mountains and sweet water in the name of Kashmir as the furthest that this entity walked before he began the journey, not precisely home, but the journey towards what this very dedicated entity felt was his future and his chosen ministry. While this entity had been traveling, one of the entity's relatives, the one known to this instrument as John the Baptist, had begun his own ministry. Feeling under a real compulsion to purify himself and to allow to fall from himself all things that were not holy, the one known as John began to attract followers to himself with a very simple and direct message, the message of the prophets from time immemorial. Return to the Creator, cease from error, and serve only the highest and the best. This entity had begun what he called the baptism, the washing of the self in symbolic and ceremonial manner, in such a way that the water was seen as that emblem which washes away all sin. The power of this entity's purity and his charisma created an ever larger group of followers wherever this entity chose to appear, from those reaches of the desert into which no one went. And it was at the place where the one known as John the Baptist was baptizing the one known as Jesus found both the inspiration to set a beginning and the beginning on his ministry. It is remarkable, given the fact that one known as John was a family member, that this entity recognized in his cousin, the one known as Jesus, not a cousin, not a relative, but the Messiah as he understood the term, the one who comes in the name of the Lord. A tremendous amount of power was transferred from John to Jesus and from Jesus to John at that time. It was truly a remarkable day, and one in which may be seen to the point at which the one known as Jesus moved from witness to actor, from being to doing, from potential to actual, from inner to outer. If we might, we would pause to note at this time the length of time that the one known as Jesus had walked through the wilderness, talked to all those men of wisdom that he could find, and went through the purification of the pilgrimage, wherein there is no provision made for food or comfort, but only 2 feet upon a dusty road and strangers at the end of the day. Such training is essential if one wishes to create the life which has depth and power. And this was done by the one known as Jesus, not because he felt it was right, but because the thirst for hunger for truth drew him ever onward, and the beauty of the search was irresistible. So that there was both the stick of his hunger and the carrot of his beauty, of those spaces within which he found himself able to occupy, because of those long acquaintance with silence, the long discipline of the body, and the long time of listening, both to others and to what they had to say, and to the voice of his own thoughts. Indeed, it was mentioned by several entities in the conversation preceding this meditation that it is a very interesting thing simply to watch one's thoughts and be aware of them as they arise, not to judge them, but to become aware of the content of the thought, especially those thoughts that repeat themselves. It is a process wherein one is able to go deeper and deeper within the self simply by careful observation. During this period, the one known as Jesus had for the most part kept himself apart from any personal relationships, either with men or with women. But certainly this entity was not those without men and women that he loved. The life of a wandering preacher is not a life which can easily be accommodating to a mate and a growing family, and it was the one known as Jesus feeling that these were not pleasures of which he might partake. Consequently, for the most part, this entity held himself apart and was content to have unspoken yet very deep relationships with his mother, his brother, his cousin, and those disciples, both men and women, whose hearts he could see to be of that same thirst and hunger for truth that his was. Almost all of the writings concerning the one known as Jesus have to do with those stories that this teacher told during the 3 years or so of his active ministry. We do not find possible with this instrument in a conscious state to move into such details as are perhaps wished for there is an intrinsic shallowness to such stories, which, since this instrument has asked for a certain kind of contact, do not fall within the parameters of that contact. In terms of the essence or the gist of this entity's life, we might say that this entity was a sweet yet fierce entity by personality, ruthless in seeking, ruthless in self-observation, and gifted with the ability to grasp people's nature, and in some cases, even what they were thinking. This did not endear him to most people, for there is something frightening about an entity who can gaze not at you but into you. And so he was often an intimidating presence. Certainly those who were in the structure of authority in the religious life of the surrounding society found the entity more and more disturbing. In part, it is because this entity dwelt in a part of the world in which he was a marginal native, which is to say that he was dwelling close to a large number of those whom one would call Judeans, or those of the tribe of Judah. This tribe happened to carry with it a very, shall we say, right-wing or conservative point of view in which a great deal of emphasis is placed upon the attitude of the body, the dress of the body, the proper ritual for each day and each hour of the day, and so forth. There was a feeling that these religious observances created a spiritually well-lived life, whereas to the one known as Jesus' point of view, all of these rules and regulations were far from being helpful, actually those things which obscured one's view of the Creator. This entity's greatly wished for people to do precisely that which his cousin John suggested, to change their life. As this instrument heard in the sermon at her religious observance this morning, that priest who offered those thoughts was saying the term repent literally meant to turn around, to turn the life around. That was the conclusion to which the one known as Jesus had come, that there was more to the metaphysical entity which was called Israel than the tribe of Judah. There was more to being a spiritual seeker than the outer forms. Naturally, since this entity had for years training in mysticism and those practices of silence that mysticism encourages, he had little patience with those who identified spiritually with religious observance. Further, this entity, having been on the verge of big towns, not truly urban in nature, and not truly those who wander the nomadic portions of his people, became convinced that his basic mission was to wake up all of the scattered tribes of Israel. This instrument has taken time to study with the one she calls Papa, the makeup of the other tribes of the so-called nations of Israel. In working with this concept, this instrument discovered that the scattering of the tribes of Israel has resulted in simply a large number of dispersed Jewish people, but rather those that have become the Orthodox Christians and the Protestant Christians simply because of the pattern of their dispersal and because of the march of time, because of the march of Christian and the world history. Therefore, it may be said honestly that the one known as Jesus, to a great extent over a long period of approximately 2,000 years, has indeed had his message shared amongst all of those who were lost. And the message always remained simple. Even when the one known as Jesus was in the most mortal crisis, what this entity did to position his disciples, those who were going to carry on after him, for their own teaching was to, as the one known as T said, use something very familiar. In this case, it was not water, because there was not water to drink with the meal, but rather the wine. But this entity chose to take meat and drink as symbols of his nature, and what this entity said was, when you eat bread, remember me. When you drink wine, remember me. Again, the word remember, like the word repent, is key. To remember is to gather the members together. The one known as Jesus wished to gather all those together who had come to learn and serve in the grist mill of planet Earth. The one known as Jesus had an awareness that the time was short. That same awareness that you may see again and again whenever entities of great inspiration and purity have come to grips with the deeper tides of time and space. In the sense of actual time, 2,000 years does not seem to be a short time. Gazed at across the expanse of a cycle of time, which is perhaps 75,000 years long, the last 2,000 years, the cycle of Pisces, indeed would seem a short time. Especially because the one known as Jesus had to some extent developed the ability to work within what this instrument calls circular time, and so was aware of both linear time and that level of consensual reality that all here share, and also of the underlying reality of the inner planes, in which the end times, as this instrument is used to calling them, had already begun. Things occur within the inner planes long before they begin to appear within the physical plane. The roots of the physical experience are often figured as a tree which grows in heaven and whose branches only reach the earth, so that things have already occurred in the root of the tree and in the trunk of the tree of destiny, long before they appear as leaf and blossom upon the branches of consensus reality or physical life. This entity did not precisely see himself as Jesus the Christ, Son of God. That is preached by many, and that he saw himself as one who had emptied himself out in order that he might take on a larger persona. He saw it as the taking on of his life mission. He saw it as his acceptance of the return to the Father and his immolation of himself in the Father. He saw himself as the entity whose only desire was to fulfill those plans that he sensed the Father had. And indeed, it is notable that at one point he said to his disciples, "I have meat and drink that you know not of." And his disciples were puzzled because they had not given him any food, because he said to them, "My food is to do the will of the Father who sent me." Again, the figures of food and drink are used to indicate that which truly nourished this particular entity. The entity was not one who castigated himself or tried to beat down his human nature. Rather, he was one whose hunger for purity was such that he very much wanted and leapt towards the ability to lose himself, lose that ego structure, which would have its desires and wants apart from the will of the Father. To the one known as Jesus, all else was as nothing and simply was allowed to fall away. Not that this entity denied his roots, his past, and so forth, but that the entity had embraced a life which he saw truly as his destiny. And that destiny was only defined day by day. He could not know the will of the Father for any day but today. Thus the prayer which he taught focused upon one day and asked certain simple things. Let earth be like heaven. Let us bring heaven to earth. Let all people take care of each other. Let people judge each other as they wish to be judged, and let all praise, glory, and power be given only to the Creator. These are some of the highlights, some notable parts of this entity's being that really stand out to us as we gaze at this entity's incarnation. The cloak of Christhood was not always light. The one known as Jesus suffered and indeed laid his arms out upon that tree, of which the one known as Dave Matthews sang, and gave up the life, the cloak, and all. As we gaze at the moment of sacrifice, we offer the words, "Not my will, but thine." To indicate the strength of this entity's dedication, it was not that he had no ego. It was not that he was not human. He had personality, humor, anger, all of the emotions. He was a normal entity, within the parameters of normalcy, shall we say. He was fortunate in his gifts and pure and thorough in his dedication. Indeed, this entity's life is greatly to be admired and gazed upon through the smoky glass of imperfectly written and poorly remembered stories. Even the imperfections and distortions cannot hide that message of oneness, what this instrument would call the law of one, that he brought. Much has been said within this group and within your culture concerning that which this instrument calls the second coming, and we say to each of you, the cloak of Christhood is each entity's destiny. The walk from earth to heaven, from third density to fourth, is a walk that all shall take. Each has ego, each has personality, yet each has gifts and dedication, 2 feet and a dusty path. Blessings abound. Question: was Jesus aware of his status, being a wanderer to planet Earth? And how did the one known as Jesus approach his suffering? What did he tell himself when he felt emotions of anger or doubt or frustration or pain? The one known as Jesus was in no way aware of any cosmic past or indeed the possibility of other worlds or other entities upon other worlds. However, this entity was well trained as a mystic and had the sense of limitless space within. In terms of how this entity dealt with its own ego when facing suffering, this entity moved almost entirely upon what this instrument would call resonance. When faced with suffering, this entity would step into a place within its consciousness in which he was able to drift in silence and wait for resonance. And when that resonance would come, it almost never would come with words, but rather with purified emotions, as this instrument would call them. Those feelings that move far beyond the surface feeling of anger or pain, those feelings that are of connection and lightness, so that the one known as Jesus was simply able to disconnect from the suffering that was going through, not denying it or repressing it, but allowing it and even leaning into it and dedicating that very suffering to the Infinite One in total faith that it was the perfect place to be. The mantra always was, "What will thou have me do?" That was one blazing concern that overrode every emotion and every pain, and that was the absolute determination to penetrate what the Godhead wished and to accomplish it. And to this entity, That meant bringing all of the scattered people together and bringing them into an awareness and a remembrance of who they are and why they were here. The genius of this entity was that his goal was high enough to last 1,000 years. We thank you. It is a great joy to be with you, and we are sorry that it is time for us to leave this instrument and this group. Know that we are always with you, as we said to the one known as S about the one known as C. At any time, if there is a desire for us to be of aid, we will be aware of it in the manner of your inner planes in what this instrument will call circular time. So we are there the instant that you ask. We assure you, however, that we are not there if you do not ask. Consequently, if there is a presence, especially an annoying, repetitive presence that calls itself by our name, we suggest that you challenge it in the name of Jesus the Christ, for that will scatter any forces that do not come in unconditional love and service to others. We leave you as always in the love and in the light of the one infinite Creator. We rejoice and we bid you, Adonai, Adonai. So these two channelings I found quite interesting. For many of you, you might not have enjoyed these channelings as much. For many people that listen to the Quo material, you're just not as interested in information about Jesus, and I get it. I just found some of this to be so resonant with the Neville Goddard material that we read. Particularly that first channeling really talks about how each of us are going through this process of awakening the Christ within, giving birth to the Christ within, that we're all virgins giving birth to this Christ, giving virgin birth to the Christ within. There's nothing that you can point out in the Law of One material that contradicts in any way to the Neville Goddard material. That's what's so wonderful about it. And the awakening that Neville Goddard had is the same awakening that Jesus had, and it's the same awakening that we all had. And what's so exciting about the Neville Goddard material is that there are others that have awoken like Jesus, and there are more than just Neville. People are awakening all the time to the Christ within, to the Creator within. Intelligent infinity comes within us, and there is a discussion in these channelings about the nature of that. Is it like a walk-in? Maybe it is a little bit like a walk-in. You don't lose your individuality, but you become aware of a greater presence of infinite intelligence, or intelligent infinity, as they call it. This intelligent energy enters into you and it transforms you. The veil is somewhat lifted, and in some cases completely lifted, and you know who you truly are and your power. And that's the shift that we're going on from third into fourth density. It's this shift of awareness to our true God power and our Christhood. And that is what happened here. There's some little tidbits of fascinating information regarding the kings that arrived, the things that were happening in the sky. And I find all of that stuff interesting. I usually do. I've always been fascinated by what happened with Jesus between ages of 13 and 33. I'm always interested in the stories. And so many different accounts say that he did go through India, through Pakistan, through different places. And why not? Of course he did. What is so incredibly sad about the Master Jesus is that he didn't write. So if you go with the traditional evangelical Christian point of view, God actually is the only person, according to the evangelical Christian point of view, Jesus is the only person to have become God. Why wouldn't he write? Why would he let others say his words for him? But he didn't write. And the point is, he didn't have to. He wasn't all about what others thought. He was in the moment. Writing was not important for him. He was in the moment of service, encountering this Christhood within, and others wrote his words because they were so naturally powerful. And it can happen to you. That's what I believe. We're all one being. We're all the same Christ, and we're moving towards that. And when the planet discovers this, I'm so excited to see what the effects of that will be. In any case, you can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com. Welcome to The Reality Revolution.